Hi, so today we're going to talk about this idea of inner critic. But before we do that, every year around this time, I reach out to folks and ask them if they could help support the creation of these videos that I do throughout the year, 2, 3 a month, along with my Instagram account, which is Will Sharon 1015. I'll put all this in the notes below. But I have a Patreon account. It's $3 a month, 36 bucks a year. And I really appreciate it if you can afford that if you would subscribe to it, because it helps defray the cost of and the expense of the equipment and all that kind of stuff to put these things together. So if you can handle that, I'd be most appreciative. Okay, so let's talk about inner critic. What is this? Well, I really wasn't aware of this term until probably I became a coach. And then you find inner critic and sometimes saboteur used a lot in the coaching paradigm. And these are described as sort of these voices inside you that tell you, no, you can't succeed and you should keep your mouth shut and all this stuff, right? And there is a technique of mindfulness where those thoughts come up and you make a decision not to pay attention to them. Nothing wrong with that. And it works from a tactical perspective. It works. The problem is that voice, that inner critic, comes from somewhere. It's not a bad part of you, this part of you that doesn't want you to succeed. It's not true. So what I want to talk to you about today is, where does that come from? And I'm going to start by reading a poem that Robert Bly wrote. And I read this poem at the beginning of every class I teach because I think it describes the state of mind that most clients are in, certainly when they come to me. So it's called One Source of Bad Information. It goes like this. There's a boy in you about 3 years old, and he hasn't learned a thing for 30,000 years. Sometimes it's a girl. This child had to make up its mind how to save you from death. He said things like, stay home, avoid elevators, eat only elk. You live with this child, but you don't know it. You're in the office, yes, but live with this boy at night. He's uninformed, but he does want to save your life. And he has. Because of this boy, you survived a lot. He's got 6 big ideas. 5 don't work. Right now, he's repeating them to you. Okay. So what's this about? Well, first of all, let's understand something, that your past is your current story of what happened. And we could do another video someday about how memory changes over time. And it's usually a product of your experience. So for example, in my case, my father was somebody I was terrified of when I was 5 and 6 and 7 years old. And by the time he died, I was taking care of him and talking to him 3 times a week. And I saw him very differently than I did when I was a little kid, right? Obviously, that's what happens to us. So this idea of the past is kind of a fiction that we've created because we operate in linear time. Your past is really your current story about what happened. Okay, so let's take an example of a child, little girl, who's like 4 or 5. And what her experience tells her is that every time her mother gets upset, she blames the child. And initially it's very confusing because the child couldn't figure out what she has done. And as a matter of fact, even later on, the child can't figure out what she's really done, but develops a strategy that says, if I take the blame, then I know what's going to happen. I'm going to be blamed. If I accept that and I'm sorry and all this stuff, then I can sort of predict what's going to happen and it's going to be stable. Okay. Now, we can look at that and say, well, that's the beginning of some real pathology and so forth. But the important thing is to look at the brilliance of that child. What could she do? Well, she could protest, she could resist, she could argue, she could fight, she could throw a tantrum, she could do all kinds of stuff, in which case it will not be so predictable what the outcome's going to be. So she begins to develop this story that whenever her mother is upset, it's her fault. And that story then gets translated into her adult life. Now, it doesn't necessarily predominate because let's say that this girl grows up and becomes educated and has talents and skills and has a career and so forth, right? And then in terms of interpersonal interactions, there is this story inside her that says, it's my fault. Whatever it is, it's my fault. Even though as an adult, she's got experience that's telling her, well, that doesn't seem to work. That's not really true. But that's the feeling. And the feeling counts. The feeling counts much more than what you figure out. Okay? Now, so we could say that that story is that child's inner critic, right? It's going to come up all the time. And through a mindfulness process, we can train her. When that comes up, you're not going to pay any attention to it. You're going to pay attention to these other affirmations that say it's not your fault, and you have agency, and so on and so forth. Now, does that work? Yes, it does work. But it's tactical. In other words, it will work for certain situations, but what we have is a story that is probably hardwired. Maybe not, but could be hardwired. What does that mean? It's going to be very resistant to any kind of real change in terms of saying, no, that's wrong. That's not who I am. So the key here, it seems to me, is to honor that child, is to honor the development of that strategy that, just like in Bly's poem, saved your life, or at least your sanity, right? It was a way that you had to cope with the situation you grew up in. And so if you honor that aspect of yourself, and this is sometimes referred to parts work or the internal family systems model, where basically you personalize, you make that part of you a person. Maybe it's this little girl, maybe it's an old lady who's yelling at you, whatever it is, and you begin to have a conversation with that part of yourself. And the conversation goes something like, look, thank you for protecting me. Thank you for looking out for me. But I'm grown up now. And I want you to try and calm down a little bit. And actually, if there's something you'd rather do than this, and that's a whole conversation, that's a number of different conversations. Let's see if we can find out something else for you to do. Okay. By honoring it, you're not in this fight with it, okay? You're not saying, oh, that's a bad part of me that's trying to get in my way so that I can't achieve the success that I want to achieve, or I can't have the relationship that I want to have. It's a hard road, and it's, over time, not going to work. So the first step is to honor, okay? And and to see the genius that went into the creation of that story. If it is hardwired, if it is so central to you because it went on for so long, what do? Well, one thing is you can, through this honoring process, calm it down a little bit. But the other thing you need to do, and the primary thing you need to do, is gain experience that counterbalances that story. In other words, you create a new story. So does that old story ever go away? Does it rear its head and go, well, maybe you're to blame? Maybe not, but it doesn't have as much room as it used to have to basically take over your life and become your inner critic or saboteur. So the reason I'm talking about this is those words, inner critic, and sometimes saboteur is used, they're kind of synonymous. I don't care what you say, there's a judgment in that. Inner critic, something inside you criticizing you. And the implication is criticizing you for something that is wrong. They shouldn't be criticizing you. All right. That's a problem, it seems to me, in the coaching world, that we allow that, or we promote that idea with a client, that somehow there's a part of them that is standing in their way. There isn't. There's just a part of them that's trying to protect them from something that probably doesn't exist anymore. And it's an issue because it deals with something that has been identified as a problem. And it seemed to me, as a former therapist, once I got into coaching, I was stunned by the idea that we didn't work with problems. It wasn't a problem. You had an agenda. Where do people usually start with their agenda? I don't want this, right? I don't want this job. I don't want this career. I don't want this relationship. This sucks. I don't like this, okay? Usually that's where we start. And you need to spend a little bit of time understanding exactly what it is that you don't want. It gets very dangerous at some point. Why? Because if you perseverate on what you don't want, you end up getting a PhD in it. You end up understanding, oh my God, not only don't I want that, but I don't want this and I don't want that. And now you have this other story that we've unearthed about how you're to blame. And then you can get a PhD in understanding how you blamed yourself, and so on and so on and so on. Not useful. Okay. We want to understand what you don't want as a launching pad into what you do want. All right. And that's the other thing that crowds out the old story. Because when you start to move towards what you do want, and by the way, identifying that sometimes is a real struggle. Sometimes it takes a while to figure out what you do want. But once you do, it feels better, right? And so this old story of being blamed, which doesn't feel very good, is getting less room. I'll give you a physical example. There was a time in my life after my corporate career was finished and before I became a coach, where I became a personal trainer, probably the oldest one in Manhattan, okay? And everybody would come in and their heads would be cantilevered out in front of their body. Why? Because they were on computers all day long, right? And this sort of forward rotation also went down into their shoulders. So what do? I mean, do you tell people to stand up straight? It doesn't really work. Okay, so technique that I came up with was, you send emails all day, right? Oh yeah, I send a lot of emails. Okay, so here's what we're gonna do. Every time you click that mouse, you're just gonna rotate your shoulders back, okay? And you're gonna pull your head back. Just that, okay? Don't have to hold on to it, don't have to do anything. So now if you really do send 20, 30, 50 emails a day, all of a sudden you're going into a position that your body likes. You go, oh, this feels good, right? Much better than this. And what happens is, in a relatively short period of time, you're sitting up straight. You don't need to go on the internet and buy one of those crazy things you're going to strap on your back. It's not necessary. All that's necessary is to put yourself in a situation, in a position, in this case, that feels better. Oh, this feels better. Okay. Same thing with your stories. Okay. Same thing with this part of you that's supposed to be an inner critic. It's like focusing on that and trying to deal with that from a mindfulness perspective is a real struggle. It's like telling somebody to stand up straight. Even if they want to, it's not going to work. They got a lot of other stuff going on. What works is when something starts to feel better. Okay. And that is really the process of the work that I do. And why the reason I choose to work with dreams is because they're a direct message to you. Usually they start out with, oh, this is how you're organizing your experience. Is this what you want? Okay. So you'll have dreams about, in this person's case, they'll have dreams about, being blamed for this or the cause of that, or not having any agency to stand up and say what they want. Okay. So that's the starting place. This is how you're organizing your experience. Then what becomes essential is we get some alternate experience. We sort of feed that into the machine, different experience, putting themselves in situations where people don't know them, putting themselves in situations where they're going to show their expertise, all that kind of stuff. What happens? Oh, it feels pretty good. Feels good. Okay. And your dream world begins to express that back to you. Also, what happens is you become aware of the brilliance of this story you constructed because it will come up in different ways. And you say, well, geez, that's no good. I wanted to get rid of that story. Actually, you don't. Because once you understand it, and once you can see it for what it is, it's incredibly empowering. So that every time it comes up, you go, oh, okay, yeah, thank you for that. I got it. Now I'm going to go do this thing. It's not a fight. It's not a struggle. Okay. So that's the idea behind how you actually grow and transform, how you step into the next larger version of who you are. So my suggestion is that you, if you're working with this concept of inner critic, that you kind of put it on the side, put it on the shelf, and from the standpoint of what it is, look at it as a strategy that you put together for very good reasons that did protect you, even if it was very primitive. I mean, for God's sake, you were probably 4, 5, or 6 years old when you came up with it. How sophisticated could it possibly be? It's resilient, but it's not particularly sophisticated. Okay. So that's my wish for you today. And, we're going into a new year. There's a lot of stuff that's going to happen. It is going to be, I think, much more moving forward, although not necessarily less disruptive. And by the summer, I'm hoping that I can go outside and you can go outside without wearing a mask. Won't that be something? Okay. Take care of yourselves, and I'll talk to you soon.